fantastic to have the chance to introduce this seminar, as the first joint seminar between Durham and IIT Gandhinagar. And we're really hoping, well, I'm sure after that introduction, I'm absolutely sure that that this will be the first, but definitely not the last. You know, we've got, as Vikrant said, we've got existing relationships in the earth sciences, geography are on board, and you know, the mentioning of you know, other disciplines such as computer science and technology and so on, you know, is really exciting. So we're really looking forward to that. But I want to just start to introduce this morning's seminar. The title of the seminar is Understanding the Challenges of World Heritage Sites and the Role of Archaeology in the Global Context. And we're going to have 4 paper presentations of around 15 minutes each. The first one is Professor Prabhakar is going to talk about the Harappan city of Dholavira and challenges of UNESCO World Heritage status. The second is Professor Sharada, will talk about continuities of Harappan traditions, glimpses from modern communities. Then we turn to the Durham side, and Professor Sarah Semple will talk about archaeology and community, enriching understanding and skills through archaeology and heritage from the local to the global. And the fourth presentation will be Professor Robin Conningham, our UNESCO chair, and he will talk about from Kathmandu's earthquake to the bombing of Jaffna fort, the role of archaeology in South Asian post-disaster heritage responses. And then we'll follow that with some a question and answers session from the floor. And Professor Prabhakar has to teach a class after this, so we're going to take his presentation first, and we'll take questions and answers for Professor Prabhakar straight after his talk. But apart from that, we'll keep the questions and answers to the end. We have two, our Durham talks are recorded, so we were worried about the internet, the stability of the internet, so those are recorded, but obviously there's questions and answers to engage at the end, so I hope that will be fine for everybody. Okay, without me taking up any more time, I want to pass over to Professor Prabhakar to give his presentation.
Thank you, Professor Catherine. I will straight away share my screen. I hope the screen is visible.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you and good morning to you all at Durham University, and good afternoon to all at IIT Gandhinagar and attendees from India. I will be talking on the Harappan site of Dholavira, which has been recently inscribed as a World Heritage Site, which is a Harappan site, first Harappan site to be inscribed in the World Heritage List, and it has many unique features which I will be discussing briefly. To begin with, I would like to acknowledge Dr. R.S. Bisht, who is the excavator of Dholavira and who is instrumental to bring Dholavira into the limelight. And also my acknowledgements are due to IIT Gandhinagar, Durham University, Archaeological Survey of India, my alma mater, and my research colleagues, Professor J.M. Kenoyer and Randall Law. The story begins in 1924, September 20th, 1924, when an article in Illustrated London News, it published the discovery of Harappan civilization. At the time, it was known as Indus Valley Civilization, Indus Civilization, various terminologies. So it announced the discovery, also a host of pictures of artifacts, structural remains were published, and it invited the attention of scholars working in West Asia. One of them was A.H. Size, who quoted D. Morgan, who worked in Susa, and he pointed out the datable context of Harappan seals at that site, which gave the date of 3rd millennium BCE. Since then, there have been a continuous excavations, explorations all over South Asia, particularly western part of India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Oman, West Asia. There are several places which have helped in understanding the Harappan civilization in the overall context. Earlier, it was understood that it started abruptly and ended abruptly, but now the entire scenario is fast changing. We know about an antecedent phase of Harappan civilization that goes back to 8th millennium BCE. Now sites excavated in Balochistan and parts of India and Pakistan, it gives a very good sequence of the early farming communities of 8th millennium BCE onwards, how the domestication of plants and animals started, then the technology of ceramics, metallurgy, they emerged, which paved the way for regional chalcolithic cultures. And ultimately, they all integrated into the Harappan civilization around 2600 BCE. The time period for the urban phase of the Harappan civilization is from 2600 BCE to 1900 BCE. And towards its end, around 2100 BCE, there were some climatic changes, which is now very well established through climatological studies by different archaeologists, geologists, and also climatologists. They hypothesize a change in climatic regime around 2100 BCE, which might have induced the change in climatic patterns, change in rainfall, and ultimately the decline of the Harappan civilization. So it started to decline around 1900 BCE, and it again devolved into the rural cultures. So interestingly, Harappan civilization during its urban phase, it was contemporaneous with the Mesopotamians and the Oman Peninsula and Egyptian civilizations. More particular, they were having direct trade contacts with the Oman Peninsula and also the Mesopotamian civilization. Cuneiform records from several sites in Iraq and Syria, they mention about the trade relations between the Mesopotamians with Dilmun, Magan, and Meluha. Here, Dilmun is identified with Bahrain, Magan with the Oman Peninsula, and Meluha with the Harappan civilization. So we have a plethora of data now available, which clearly establishes the trade relations. So the distribution of the Harappan civilization, it's around 1 million square kilometer to 1.2 million square kilometers. It coexisted with several regional cultures in varying degrees of technological advancements. We have other cultures spread in this region, southern Aravallis and northern Aravallis of Rajasthan. We have civilizations in the Helmand region, Syria, Oman. So it's all a dynamic situation. It was not an isolation, and they were always contributing and collaborating. And the settlement hierarchy, it also gives us an idea of the administrative setup. It might have been, even though we don't have any written records, we don't know about the political setup, but yet the settlement hierarchy of the largest site at the top of the pyramid to the village sites and hamlets at the bottom of the pyramid, we do understand that they might be having a kind of a city-state kind of administrative setup. And interestingly, 6 largest Harappan cities, they are located at crucial locations to harness the raw material resources and redistribute them into the entire civilization. And coming directly to Dholavira, it is located on an island known as Kadir in the Great Run of Kutch. This is the present geographical situation, and if we reconstruct the 3rd millennium BCE geographical context, understanding the rise in sea level at that particular point of time and also the fall in land levels, we try to understand that the entire Kutch was an island. There were a series of islands on the northern part of Kutch, and even Saurashtra might have been an island. This explains how Lothal might have been connected through the little run of Kutch and not through the Saurashtra coast, because we don't have any sites on the Saurashtra coast. We have sites only on the northern coast of Kutch and also on the Kutch Island. So this also explains about a complex network of land as well as a maritime trade network, also facilitating the movement of various raw materials available in, particularly in Gujarat, the vast shell resources, the agate carnelian resources, for which the Harappans, they are very famous. Even the cuneiform records of Mesopotamia, they attest about the import of agate carnelian jewelry. So Dholavira was in an ideal situation. It was harnessing the raw material resources from the entire Gujarat region, and also might have been controlling the smaller settlements like Bagasra, Khirsara, Shikarpur, Kanmir, Surkotada for various craft activities. We have definite evidences of craft activities at the smaller sites that might have contributed to the overall trade network. And Dholavira, it is located on an island, strategically located. I mean, what brought them here, it is very difficult to understand, but it could be some defense strategies, because It's surrounded by water throughout the year at that particular point of time. And more importantly, they were understanding the local geography, the topography. They located the site in between two streams, enabling water harvesting in a better manner. So if we look into the earliest phases of occupation here, starting from around 3000 BCE, it was a small fortress, slowly expanding towards the north, and by around 2600 BCE, it reached the full configuration. The terminologies used to denote various parts of the city. It's a modern one, but the city was surrounded by a common fortification. Individual units were also fortified. There were dams across the smaller rivers which diverted water to the open areas and also into the water reservoirs located to the south and east of the castle. And towards the end, around 1900 BC, the city shrunk to the southern part, and we also get evidences of certain ceramic traditions coming from nearby Rajasthan. The craft activities which was initiated by the Harappans, it continued, and Dholavira Harappans might have participated in the trade network with West Asia even after the demise of the Harappan civilization. So Dholavira is also famous for its well laid out plan of this city with ratios and proportions. Each unit of the city is laid out in a very definitive proportions, and it was a well-planned city conceived well before it was actually occupied. So we have better state of preservation in the form of gateways due to the stone architecture, excellent evidences of the gate complexes, use of stone pillar elements which were previously found in Harappa and Mohenjo-daro. Yet we could not understand its exact function until Dholavira yielded some in situ location of these pillar members, through which we could understand the function as the exact pillar member, which supported a wooden pillar member which was supporting the roof. We also have a 10-lettered inscription which is unique to the site. It might have been affixed to on the lintel portion of the entrance gateway, but now it is in a secondary position. Might have been dismantled by the Harappan themselves and kept safely in one of the chambers. So Dholavira, with this vast network of craft activities, access to the raw materials, we have excellent evidences of various craft activities. One of them is the limestone pillar elements, which was quarried 3 kilometers north of the site, finished by giving a rough shape here. One of the pillar members lying at the site. Then it was brought to the site, completely finished, smoothened and polished, then exported to Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, probably through the river network. I mean, excellent studies conducted by Randall. It clearly establishes that it originated in the Dholavira island and ultimately they were exported too. Water harvesting system is one of the hallmark features of Dholavira, which was highlighted in the UNESCO dossier. Also, we have a series of networks in which the dams were established and the water was diverted. Even now, the open areas, in the open areas, water accumulates during the rainy season. These are some of the glimpses of the reservoirs. This one is the southern reservoirs, completely rock cut. It reaches up to 10 meters in depth and nearly 33 meters in length. It is larger than the Great Bath of Mohenjo-daro. And much larger is the East Reservoir, completely masonry built, and interestingly, a step well within that East Reservoir, which might have catered to water resources during the lean season. Excellent evidences of craft activities. One of the hallmark is the bead drilling activities. We have a material known as earnestite, which is not naturally available. The geological provenance is still not understood. But yet the scientific analysis clearly indicate that its geological provenance may be in the Kutch region. It contains quartz and silimanite and mullite peaks when viewed under XRD. Then the native techniques of bead drilling, it helped in the understanding of the better placement of this bead drilling technology by the Harappans. So they were manufacturing this kind of jewelry. They were multi-stringed and multi-segmented waistbands, more probably for the ladies, and also another white-colored decorated stone beads, which were in high demand in the Mesopotamian region. So these two hallmark beads, they occur in very wide occurrences, very different cultures, different time periods. one site in Egypt, even in Turkey, there are presence of these kind of beads, which clearly indicates the popularity of such items in the third millennium BCE. There are other aspects of material culture which clearly establishes the role of Dholavira in the overall trade network. Seals and sealings which were used for authenticating the trade transactions, and also certain human figurines, sculptures which have close parallels with those of the Mohenjo-daro examples, which may indicate certain ideological transmissions between these two sites, and a very unique burial system which have parallels with the Bahrain tumuli, wherein only the royal persons were buried, but here we don't know the exact nature of the persons who were buried inside, but it's a remarkable feature at the site of Dholavira, along with several other burial systems. So with this entire knowledge of the technology, the layout of the city, the location of the city, and its overall role in the trade network, we decided, I mean, I was previously associated with Archaeological Survey of India, so that's how I was associated with the writing of the nomination dossier. So we proposed the site for inclusion in the World Heritage List, initially proposing a nominated area of 1 square kilometer and 1.5 million square 1.5 square kilometer area of the buffer zone. As per the ICOMOS recommendation, we expanded this buffer zone into the entire northwestern tip of this island to include more sites, because Dholavira was not in isolation. There were other archaeological remains dated to the 3rd millennium BC. One is a reservoir upstream of Mansar, quarry sites northeast of Dholavira, some coastal sites. So all of them, they were included in the buffer zone, so that now we have a nearly 48.65 square kilometer of buffer zone, which can cater to the future necessities also. So these were the two criteria 3 and 4, under which Dholavira was inscribed, and some of the important features include the exceptional example of a protohistoric Bronze Age settlement, and also urban planning and water reservoirs and network system which is to be. But since it is an excavated site, there are issues of conservation, which really poses a serious threat if it is not tackled properly. But Archaeological Survey of India already devised certain measures during the preliminary investigations, and the most important factors which causes the surface erosion is due to the rainwater during the summer season, which can be very severe when there is more rainfall. So particularly in areas of the southern and the eastern reservoir, there are several rain gullies. I mean, we can notice just on the surface. If you can notice, there are many surface runoff which ultimately reach the southern reservoir and the eastern reservoir. So some of the rain gullies are shown here. To counter them, and this is the scenario when there is rainwater. You can see the kind of erosional activities happening, and it is ultimately leading to the flooding of the reservoirs. And even the excavated areas within the city used to be flooded. So to counter them, we designed a series of contour drains so that we can divert the rainwater away from the reservoirs, and also plug in certain low-lying areas so that we can divert the water. One such area is this entire central area of Castle, from where rainwater used to accumulate in a huge quantity. So it was diverted through a concealed drain and ultimately drained off to outside the city. So this proved to be highly successful. One more contour drain was constructed here, which diverted the rainwater away. And also another 2 drains, they were constructed recently, which diverted the rainwater from the southern reservoirs. One more factor which causes much harm to any archaeological site is the visitor movement. I mean, the careless movement of visitors over the excavated remains is a major threat. So regulation is one activity which we have planned, and also putting some barricades at the edge of the excavated remains. It proved highly successful, and also proper devising of visitor movement plan, which helps the visitor to plan the journey actually. And also an interpretation center which is going to come up very soon near Dholavira, which will clearly help the visitors to plan their visit to the site. Additionally, Dholavira is also listed as an iconic site in the Department of Tourism, Government of India, which has also planned certain activities away from the site. So they are shifting the present road. This is the present road to the east of the settlement, so it will be away beyond 500 meter, and also locating certain developmental activities much away from the site. So this will all help a controlled tourism mechanism, which will really help sites like this. And one more thing, it's located in a fragile environment because of one of the largest salt marshy environment, and it is house for the migratory birds like flamingos, and also the wild ass of the Kutch region. So overall, it's of a diverse nature. It has archaeological remains, it has natural features, we have migratory birds. So everything is it's in the case of Dholavira, but the proper regulation, implementation of certain rules and regulations by the enforcement agencies have largely helped in controlling the modern developments to a certain extent. But ultimately, what happens is that the controlled tourism movement will go a major way in protecting this site to a larger extent. And one example I can quote is of Mohenjo-daro, which is the other Harappan site in the World Heritage List, which also faces enormous conservation issues because of the high water table. There is a capillary rise, the bricks are crumbling down. So it's a huge problem for conserving an excavated site. And fortunately, in the case of Dholavira, we have a stone architecture which helps in kind of controlling or mitigating certain problems but issues. But surface control, visitor movement, and a better interpretation will help in the overall conservation preservation of this site. Thank you, and this is my last slide. Thank you very much for patient hearing.
Thank you very much, Professor Prabhakar. That was fascinating. Fantastic images of the site, and I can see, even as a non-archaeologist, I can see some areas of discussion around conservation and preservation of the site. And I was fascinated to see that Dholavira had a castle and a bailey, exactly like Durham does. So yeah, are there any questions for Professor Prabhakar? Because Professor Prabhakar has to go and teach a class after this. But maybe there's some comments or questions, possibly from the Durham side, or from participants and attendees on the call. Sarah,
Catherine,
yeah.
sorry, yes, I can
go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, thank you for an absolutely amazing talk, and what an incredible site, but also what challenges that it faces in terms of impacts from climate and tourism. I inevitably, because of my interests, I wanted to ask how Dholavira is being integrated perhaps into sort of local programs of education and engagement, and whether that also puts pressure on the site, or whether that offers opportunities perhaps for thinking about sort of care and preservation within the immediate locality.
One of the main objectives is to engage the local communities. The local communities, they are so much integrated with the site. You see, when the site was excavated, the first season when it happened in 1989, they didn't have any awareness. I mean, the local people, they didn't know about what is heritage, what is Harappan, everything. So slowly what happens, if you now go and discuss with the villagers, they, explain a lot about Harappan civilization, how Dholavira is important. So that's how the research at Dholavira has helped in. And ultimately, it has now entered into the education. Even the textbooks, they have information about Dholavira. There is wider publicity. And again, there is a threat on this also. I consider personally, because of the fragile environment, too much of exposure on these kind of activities may ultimately cause more harm. But fortunately, the government of India have come out with this iconic site name tag, and also restriction on the developmental activities. Now everything is planned away, so more awareness is there, and also community participation is also there.
Great, thanks. That's really interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, Professor Robin asks, what is the expected population? It's very difficult because hardly 5 to 10% of the site is excavated. And drawing parallels from Mohenjo-daro, I mean, it's a 76 hectare lower town. The population is estimated to around 40,000. So taking into account of Mohenjo-daro's house complexes excavated and Dholavira's house complexes, I would suggest around 8 to 10,000 could be the population.
Thank you.
That's great. Are there any more questions or comments? That was fantastic, Professor Prabhakar. I mean, I've got loads of questions that I want to ask, but I won't hold us up because we have so. Thank you so much for that presentation, and a round of applause, a virtual round of applause for your presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're going to move on now to our next speaker. Professor Sharada is going to talk about continuities of Harappan traditions, glimpses from modern communities.
Thank you, Professor Montgomery. Yeah, can you hear me?
Thank you.
So I will share my screen now, and please let me know if you can see it.
Yes, yes, we can see it.
Yeah, I'm going full screen now.
That's
okay.
Perfect.
Yeah, and I'm clearly audible.
Yes, we can hear you too.
Okay. So a very good morning and afternoon to our respected panelists, and perhaps even a good evening to many of the audience members who have joined us from different corners of the globe. It's my privilege and pleasure to be a part of this wonderful event, and I thank you for this opportunity. My talk is titled Continuities of Harappan Traditions, Glimpses from Modern Communities. In the previous talk, Professor Prabhakar beautifully summarized the antecedents and the developmental trajectories of Harappan civilization from the early food-producing era to the localization era, how one of its very prominent sites, that is Dholavira, was nominated as a protected zone, and essentially what the civilization signifies for us. And thus, I will not be delving into these aspects, again, to provide context to my own talk. The topic of the previous talk, however, led me to wonder and question whether all that remains of this magnificent civilization are some lifeless broken structures and a few material manifestations, and should only they be protected and preserved for us and for the future? Did the civilization completely fizzle out, as was postulated for decades together by many archaeologists since its discovery in 1929, followed by the second phase of the urbanization in the Gangetic Plains and the subsequent establishment of many dynastic rules in the early historical period? But this was marked by several hiatuses or intermittent dark periods, or can we in fact or indeed trace its cultural continuum to the present? A review of the archaeological and environmental data makes it quite clear that the civilization did not disappear abruptly or suddenly because of possible foreign invasions, the outbreak of diseases, recurrent floods or earthquakes, and depletion of economic resources. Current archaeological studies and their findings suggest that in the event of such adversities and their aftermath, the Harappan cultural fabric could have been weakened, perhaps, bringing about some gradual changes in the settlement location, subsistence, space, and economy. But the dominant response to them was that of adaptation and resilience. In fact, many Harappan elements continued to survive for a considerable amount of time in a very large part of what we presently know as the Sindh region, southeastern Balochistan, the northern and the western parts of India. They surface and resurface in later cultures too. In the forthcoming slides, I will highlight a few clear instances of such cultural continuities, a few of them in various parts of the subcontinent. And in keeping with the theme of the seminar, draw your attention to the fact that it's not just the archaeological sites that deserve to be preserved, but also the physical spaces in their vicinity and of the nearby regions, the living peoples that inhabit them, and the traditions and ancient knowledge systems that they are the practitioners and torchbearers of. So I will straight away move to one of the elements, that is town planning and architecture. The Harappans are very well known for their meticulous settlement layouts and urbanized architecture. So although by 1800 BC, the impressive system disintegrated with the collapse of the urban phase, some remnants of the characteristic features and techniques survived in the smaller rural settlements and reappeared in the early historic period almost 1,000 years later. Most Harappan cities, akin to the early historical ones, this has in fact been written about by Professor Conningham, who is here with us today. Most of these cities were large-sized, oriented along with the cardinal directions, were enclosed within walls and followed the grid plans or patterns. Another Harappan urban feature was the threefold divisions of the cities. For instance, at Dholavira, as pointed out by Professor Prabhakar and the excavator Professor Bisht, he found three distinct areas which we all popularly know as Citadel, Middle Town, and Lower Town. And he finds them quite analogous to three interesting terms that appear in the Rig Veda much later, that is Parama, Madhyama, and Avama. It is well known that a typical Harappan house, which I have shown here on the right side, comprised a central courtyard, rooms on three sides, and a wide entrance on the fourth side. An artistic reconstruction of one such multi-roomed house complex can be seen here, but its archaeological counterpart can be seen at many excavated Harappan sites, in fact. One such example is that of Farmana, a mature Harappan site in the state of Haryana. We can see that the aerial view of the trenches and the exposed structures and features on your left. So this mature Harappan site in Haryana, we can see a wide street which is flanked by multi-roomed house complexes on both sides. Each housing complex unearthed several multiple rooms and a central courtyard. There were fireplaces, large storage jars which were still embedded in the soil, bathing platforms, and several such interesting features. So here are some more visuals which attest to the similarities and continuation of these archaeological and architectural features, even in the present day village of Farmana, which is situated very close to the site, around 5 kilometers from there, and we can easily discern these patterns. For example, this typical village house also has an angan, or the central courtyard, with hearths, fireplaces, large storage jars, pots in which water and milk are stored for ready use, and the archaeological counterpart of which you can see at the bottom left picture, which is at the site of Farmana. We also see a lot of small rooms here around the angan or the courtyard, which could have which function as sleeping quarters or storage rooms. On the right side, you have a bird's eye view of the village headman or the zamindar's house, which also has a similar layout with a wide entrance gate on one of its sides. Even the dimensions of the houses and the lanes of the streets are quite similar. When we go southwards to Rajasthan, techniques of wall building and floor laying have been preserved to the very last detail. For instance, the mixing of terracotta nodules and charcoal can still be evidenced in houses around another important Harappan site, Kalibangan, situated in the present-day state of Rajasthan, a technique which has remained unchanged for more than 4,500 years. Drainage patterns have also persisted over millennia. On the left, we have the archaeological remains, quite well preserved, in fact, of the drains running parallel between the houses at the site of Harappa. We see similar drains in the present-day village of Farmana in Haryana, where they lie between the houses and the streets. Many Harappan sites have yielded wells constructed with regular ratioed bricks, as well as wedge-shaped or trapezoidal bricks. The picture on top here is of one such well at the site of Mohenjo-daro, and the one here at the bottom could be, in fact, any village in India. Such wells have come to light at quite a few historical sites as well, even in the southern part of India. Huge soap jars of terracotta also remained in use in the post-Harappan times. With massive water reservoirs, thick fortifications, stone and brick-built houses in the typical sectoral divisions of Castle, Middle and Lower Town, which speak of the prosperity of the Dholavirans at the peak of the civilization. There also lie the ruins of circular huts made of wattle and daub with post holes, a picture of which you can see here on the left side, that the residents of the late Harappan phase had built and inhabited. However, these structures which depart from the regular square and rectangular shaped ones are also not very unique. In fact, modern day locals in the same region where the site is located, that is the Kutch region, continue to adopt these circular shapes, and their huts which you can see here on the right side, popularly or vernacularly known as the Bhunga huts, continue to echo these structures. I now come to agriculture. Several Harappan agricultural practices, such as the use of ox carts and plowshares, have continued till the present times in the subcontinent. For instance, a plowed field at Kalibangan, a Harappan site in Rajasthan dated to around 2800 BCE, yielded excellent evidence of intercropping. Here, we see a double network of perpendicular furrows, which was prepared, in which taller crops grew in the north-south furrows and the shorter crops grew in the east-west furrows. This system is still prevalent in some of the farming lands near the site. We have here evidence of a photograph taken in the 1960s, which shows a similar pattern of furrows for agricultural purposes. The terracotta model of a plow found at Banavali, a Harappan site in Haryana, miniaturized toy carts with wheels, found at many Harappan sites, and which could in fact be moved around with strings attached to them, bear testimony to the staunch survival of their designs in the carts used in rural areas even today. So for instance, we have the toy cart here at the top and a modern day replica of it or continuation of it in the Sindh region. Coming to shipping, we are now quite sure that the Harappans were navigators not only over land, but over water too, and had established a strong inter-regional and external network for the movement of raw materials and finished commodities. In evidence of this, we have three representations of boats that have been recovered. Here we have an example of a tablet from Mohenjo-daro, which depicts a boat. At the bottom left, we have a traditional Mohana boat on the Indus, and on the bottom right, a traditional bullock cart with a flat-bottomed ferry boat used for local transport along the Indus River, which you can see in the background. And this is located very close to the ancient site of Mohenjo-daro in Sindh. In fact, it is Professor Kenoyer who has very meticulously observed and documented these similarities. Coming to metrology, Harappans definitely had a penchant for mathematics and standardization. For instance, the common brick sizes followed a ratio of 1:2:4, often found in proportions of rooms, houses, and some public buildings. Another interesting case of the standardized system is that of stone weights, which you can see here, a picture of which you can see on the slide. They come in the shape of cubes or truncated spheres made of chert or semi-precious stones. The weights begin with 1, which is below a gram, to over those which weigh more than 10 kgs. Taking the smallest weight, which is about 0.86 grams as a unit, first a series grows geometrically, with the next weight being twice that unit, the next weight twice again. And so to be precise, the series runs as 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, and 64. Then, instead of continuing with doubling the weights, which would give us 128, 256, and so on, the series switches to multiples of the lower weights. Therefore, we have 160 units, followed by 200, 320, 640, 1600, and so on. Finally, we have 12,800. 3 scales have also been unearthed from Mohenjo-daro, Kalibangan, and Lothal. These scales have been studied by the British Indologist John E. Michener, who went a step further and established the weights were studied by the British Indologist John E. Michener, who went a step further and established correlations between the traditional system of weights in India, used quite till recent times, and those of the Harappan weights, and he saw that the difference was just about 1.8%. I come to the scales now. There are 3 scales which were found in the excavations at Lothal, Kalibangan, and Mohenjo-daro. We have them as pictures on the slide here. So the Lothal scale measures, there are 27 graduation lines spanning 46 millimeters. So 1 unit equals to 1.77 millimeters. Professor V. Mainkar, another famous metrologist, in 1984, postulated that 10 Lothal units come close to the Arthasastra's angula, that is 1.778 centimeters, according to his estimate. Arthashastra was one of the famous treatises or texts which were compiled centuries later during the Mauryan rule. And recently, Professor Danino, who is the coordinator of our center, has also worked extensively on these ratios and proportions, and he's proposed an angula of 1.76 centimeters at Dholavira. So at the bottom, we have the Kalibangan terracotta scale, which is studied by Professor R. Balasubramaniam, and he has estimated it to be a unit of 1.75 centimeters. I now come to science and technologies. So many of the Harappan sciences and technologies survived the urban collapse and reappeared in the Gangetic cities 1,000 years later. Bronze casting, as used for the famous dancing girl statuette shown here, followed the technique of sirpetyu, or lost wax, which was later quite widespread in the subcontinent, with many traditional craftsmen and artisans who use the same techniques even today. Many archaeologists have often turned to local craftsmen and artisans to understand and systematically and scientifically document the manufacturing processes of several such sciences and technologies. For instance, we have the copper bronze objects, these Harappan ceramics, which continue to be made and used by not just the potter communities, but people near them. And so they have also taken help of these communities to document the manufacturing processes of beads and bangles, gold working, shell and ivory carving, since these traditional techniques in contemporary India have changed very little since the Harappan times. Fane's craft included blue glazed ceramics produced with the same copper oxide pigments used today. Sophisticated techniques for drilling long beads. I'll be showing you some pictures of these beads later on. For coloring and bleaching were also very distinctly Harappan and are still in use today. Several Harappan sites such as Bagasra and Nageshwar have yielded excellent evidences of shell workshop areas. For instance, on the floor map of the site, excavated site of Nageshwar, we see that this particular region is where all the shell manufacturing activity was going on. So within these sites, we have excellent evidences of not just the raw materials that were procured from coasts, but also tools used for the production of these shell artifacts, discarded shell waste. For example, we have a heap of discarded shell waste here at Nageshwar, and also several finished products such as bangles, beads, ladles, and shell inlays, examples of which you can see here at the pictures on the top and the bottom. Shell artifact manufacturing is actually quite prolific even in India today, especially in the eastern part of India. And we see several Bengali women who wear a similar shell bangle called the shakha, or the conch shell bangles, to denote their marital status. Coming to ornaments, these two have survived, such as the numerous types of bangles, the semi-precious stone beads, flattened gold beads, and decorated elephant heads. Excavations at several early historic sites throughout South Asia, combined with the evidence from Harappa and also the early Vedic and epic literature, indicate that bangles continued to play an important role in rituals and in general identifying the community socially and economically. From infancy, children wear specific types of bangles as amulets for health and to enhance beauty. A young woman wears bangles during courtship or at marriage, and these bangles are replaced by different ones to symbolize her changed status. Throughout a woman's life, bangles are worn as ornaments and also to protect and preserve the family's well-being. They are removed or broken at the death of her husband, and all valuable ornaments are in fact passed on to the subsequent generations. Men also often wear bangles for physical protection in battle, for amuletic purposes, for defining status and ethnic affiliation, and simply sometimes just as ornaments. So we have here several such examples. Terracotta bangles. We have a fragment of a bronze figurine from Mohenjo-daro with an anklet. And these are the rich repertoire of gold, carnelian, and agate ornaments from Mohenjo-daro and Harappa. There are also terracotta figurines which are heavily adorned. We have an example here, and these are some of the shell bangles found at these Harappan sites. The use of shell or metal bangles on the upper and lower parts of arms has persisted in many parts of Rajasthan and Gujarat, and this recalls the style of the famous bronze statue of the dancing girl of Mohenjo-daro, who also wears them. Here we see on the right side splendid demonstrations of continuity in traditions of personal adornment of several of the indigenous communities who live around the site of Dholavira in the Kutch region. These are the women folk from communities like Rabadis, Kolis, and Bhils, who wear such bangles even today. One of the remarkable accomplishments of the subcontinent was the development of technology of dyeing and patterning of fabric. The celebrated stone statue of the so-called priest king discovered at Mohenjo-daro has these trefoil motifs and circles on the draped shawl. Some Harappan archaeologists believe that the priest king is wearing what we call an ajrak, the traditional textile of the Sindh region that is printed, mordanted, and dyed in madder and indigo, a printed cloth whose legacy continues today. Till today, we have an example of the modern-day ajrak shawl here with the trefoil motif. The Harappans indulged in games, some of which have passed down to us, albeit with modifications perhaps. They had various kinds of board games, and in Lothal, a famous set of terracotta figures does evoke chess or perhaps an ancestral form of the game chess. Such board games resurfaced in the Mauryan times as well, centuries later. There are also sets of dice of terracotta or stone found at Harappan, Mohenjo-daro, and several other Harappan sites, and they seem quite indistinguishable from today's dice. The only difference lies in the rearrangement of the numbers on the cube's faces. We also have several other smaller game pieces, such as these bird whistles and terracotta balls, or what we call hopscotches. I'm now towards the end of the presentation. So moving to symbols and iconography, it is worth pointing out that most of these few forms have also survived. For instance, the swastika symbol depicted on numerous Harappan seals requires no further elaboration. The Harappan endless knot is found all over India, which is at the far, the pictures of which are at the far right column. They are in fact found in some of the Rangoli designs and also in inscriptions. So we have here the endless knot on a Mohenjo-daro copper plate in a Gujarati inscription of King Dhruva II of Gujarat Rashtrakuta dynasty from 884 CE in the center. And the symbol repeats at a much later date at Fatehpur Sikri. Motifs commonly used on pottery such as peacocks, fish, etc. They have also lived on. The Harappans revered trees, as shown by numerous depictions of trees growing from a low platform, a frequent symbol on coins from even the early historic times, such as the Mauryan times onwards. The peepal leaf was certainly one of the most sacred trees, judging from its frequent depictions on seals and pottery, often in association with deities. Another interesting continuity is that of the Ashwatha from Vedic times to this day. We have here, for instance, the decorated arches with peepal leaves on them. This is the Ashwatha I was referring to. So here it's represented on a seal and much later in terms of statues. The other interesting evidence is that of the Pashupati seal, which has 3 faces or heads and a classic yogic posture on a raised platform with 2 antelopes below the platform. This is quite comparable to that of the iconographic form of Buddha seated on a platform with 2 deer beneath him from a monument of a much later date, that is from the Ajanta caves. Coming to religion and rituals, traditions such as the use of oil lamps, the Harappan mother goddess here, for instance, bears the cups on either side of her head and the conch shell, which was used for pouring libations. One such from Mohenjo-daro is in fact decorated with vermilion-filled incise lines, and for trumpeting, because they have these conch shells have the tips sawn off for this purpose, they also persist till the present. The famous so-called priest king wears 2 sacred marks, an eye bead at the same spot where we presently wear our bindis, and another bead on the upper part of the arm where Hindus often tie amulets or apply ashes. Several heavily decorated female statues strongly suggest the cult of a mother goddess in line with the Indian type of worship. If you look at some of the Harappan mother goddesses, one is shown here, and we see that their unmistakable reappearances occur in Mauryan art as well. The same extravagant headdresses of huge flowers encircling the faces, similar double necklaces, and the waist belt or the kamarband. We also see possible survival of Harappan signs on some of the earliest coinage or coins of the Indian subcontinent, the punch-marked coins which were minted in the early historic minted by the early historic dynasties or the Mahajanapadas from the 6th to the 2nd century AD. And these are not just 1 or 2, but quite a few of them. So finally, to kind of sum up, In view of the numerous evidences, some of which were highlighted today, archaeologists now speak of the later phases of the civilization as the localization era to reflect the splintering of the Harappan tradition into localized forms no longer cohesively held together. As Professor Kenoyer has correctly observed, the traditions and knowledge systems transformed through a series of transitions rather than abruptly ended. And these series of transitions reflect both continuity and changes. Cultures, those bygone and of today, do not completely decline or die or fizzle out, and that some knowledge systems or traditions have diffused or survived spatially and in terms of time through generation after generation into different subsystems of the contemporary societies, perhaps in their original forms and sometimes in altered forms. For most part of human history, the biggest challenge is that the only record of cultural development is derived from the archaeological record, which is plagued by incompleteness and is oftentimes of a fragmentary nature. In this regard, archaeology, I feel, is a unique discipline. It is uniquely placed through its various theoretical paradigms and methodological approaches to fill these missing gaps and provide cohesive narratives to explain both continuities as well as changes in the traditions and knowledge systems, especially in the subcontinent. It is quite essential to study, document, preserve, and engage the present-day communities for understanding the past societies and for taking up more large-scale archaeological research in the Kutch region. I specifically said Kutch region because we were talking about Dholavira, but I feel that this should be done in other parts of India as well before they go into oblivion. And so we should do this not just for the Harappan sites, but also of the succeeding cultures in order to trace this cultural continuum. Through this talk, I also wish to reiterate the urgent need for employment of more interdisciplinary tools to research the developmental trajectories of these cultural traditions from the past to the present. Last but not the least, I would like to thank several people and organizations. First of all, the organizers of this event for giving me this opportunity. I also want to thank the Archaeological Survey of India, the professors who work with me here who have been very encouraging, Professors Michel Danino, Prabhakar, Professor Bisht, and for lending me their images and textual material from which I could borrow heavily and make this presentation. I also want to thank my student Ahana Ghosh, who accompanied me for an ethnographic survey around the village of Dholavira last December. And we actually managed to witness some of these cultural continuities in the area around the UNESCO World Heritage Site. I also want to finally thank the participants of the seminar for patiently listening to this talk. Thank you so much.
Professor Sharada, thank you so much for that talk. It was fantastic, really interesting. I mean, I was fascinated to see the echoes between what was happening in 2800 BCE and the present day. So much in there that we can discuss. We're going to leave the questions and answers, however, for the end, so that we can have a discussion at the end. And so we're going to pass on to the next presentation. That's Professor Sarah Semple from the University of Durham, head of the Archaeology department at the University of Durham, and she's going to talk about archaeology and community, enriching understanding and skills through archaeology and heritage from the local to the global. And I believe Sarah's going to use a pre-recorded talk. Is that right, Sarah?
I don't have the pre-recorded talk here, so okay. I'm ready to do it live or pre-recorded.
Okay, so let me see. Perhaps Falguni might have the pre-recorded talk.
First, I would like to offer my thanks to the organisers of this seminar and for inviting me to speak. The signing of the MOU today marks another momentous step for internationalising our research contacts in archaeology at Durham. And I know there are real synergies and opportunities in archaeological and heritage science between our institutions and departments. And I look forward very much to seeing these progress. I want to start my presentation today with a very brief introduction to what makes archaeology at Durham distinctive, before moving on to highlight just a few of the projects making a difference at a local level in terms of driving community engagement. We're a world-leading department, and not just in terms of our rankings, which place us fourth in the world, but in terms of our size versus international reach as well. We number around 500 individuals with just over 30 academic staff. But we're research active across the world with significant funded collaborative work in the Middle East, South Asia and Europe. We host the leading journal Antiquity and of course the UNESCO Chair in Archaeological Ethics and Practicing Cultural Heritage, with Robin Cunningham one of only 2 specific UNESCO chair holders in archaeology globally. All of these assets, as well as state-of-the-art facilities, ideally place us to be leaders in the field. In a rapidly changing world, tangible, intangible cultural heritage assets and collections are under intense threat. And as a result, we have found ourselves at Durham changing the way that we research and practice archaeology, pivoting to meet some of those major challenges abroad and at home. This short paper, as a consequence, outlines the synergies that have emerged from our work with partners and communities in the region and in the UK and internationally. And I hope we'll show how we're using our experiences working in different parts of the world to inform our work in the Northeast region and vice versa. The global challenges of urban development, sustainability and education, health and well-being, economic growth and inequalities are all directly relevant to our Northeast region, as well as the world more broadly. Within Northeast England, vast areas of industrial development engulfed the countryside, and this latterly has sometimes compromised our heritage assets. The mobility of populations in the 19th and 20th century serving those big industrial developments also has impact on our local community in terms of people's sense of connection to the region's heritage. And of course, like many parts of the world, there are ongoing economic challenges. There is a major UK government push right now to level up in the north in terms of infrastructure and development. This puts the Department of Archaeology at Durham in a unique place. We have the ability to use our expertise, our collections, our facilities and skills to give back and benefit the Northeast region. We're in a position to drive the inclusive agenda that may develop projects that attract new audiences in relation to heritage. And we're also positioned to empower communities potentially in terms of responsibility and care for the heritage within their locality. And if we can do all of that, we may well be able to make sustainable connections between local communities and their heritage. And in doing that locally in the Northeast, make some small but significant steps towards global sustainability goals. With extensive experience garnered from collaborative work with stakeholders and communities in different parts of the world, from North America and North Africa, we have seen in archaeology that documentation and protection are key to future heritage curatorship, but embedding knowledge, care and ownership of cultural heritage within the immediate community and locality are also central to the future management and care of assets. Connecting people with their heritage, whether landscapes, historic sites and buildings or collections, can create a sense of ownership and connection, build a sense of place and strengthen the consciousness of local identity, and also empower people to advocate around care and protection for the heritage in their region. By sharing the expertise gathered from projects involving skills training and community engagement internationally, and you can see here particularly our EMENA project within the Middle East and North Africa, and Training in Action project also within North Africa, we have developed an understanding of the way in which skills training and partnering individuals and officials and organisations can strengthen and create structured, productive methods for engagement and skills training, creating a sense of responsibility for local heritage, which reaches from the local to the global. I could talk about many projects and regions, but for this presentation, I want to focus on just 4 significant themes that are central to making a difference and relevant to the Northeast projects that we host. And these are where we're implementing and developing work around reflection and engagement, productive partnering, training and empowering, and co-production. I have no doubt that such themes and pathways are very familiar to my social sciences and health colleagues in education and geography and anthropology and in many other subject areas. But these are just some of the positive advances we feel are being made by sharing our international practice with our partners in North East England in relation to identifying training needs, developing toolkits and thinking about the best methods for engagement. Methods of reflection and engagement then have been a major part in the work of the UNESCO Chair in South Asia, where stakeholder and public engagement have been critical to understanding perceptions of pilgrimage sites and mapping the intangible and tangible assets of heritage locations. Exhibitions have been used as a starting point, not only to share knowledge, but to invite public reflection on the value and impact of heritage protection. And this, in some ways, is to decolonise the expert approach as well. It's all too easy for the academic and researcher to presume and assign importance to archaeology and heritage. This reflexive practice and engagement, which involves the voice of people within a locality, is now a key part of our North East regional agenda, where World Heritage Site assets like the Roman Frontier and Durham Cathedral jostle side by side with the rich industrial heritage that speaks to the North as a powerhouse in the 19th and 20th centuries. The Wearmouth and Jarrow Perception Project was initiated with funding from Historic England, and it focused on the 7th century twin Christian monastic foundations of Wearmouth and Jarrow, which were first recorded in some of the early surviving written accounts and histories from the 7th and 8th century that attest to the development of the early Christian church in England. These sites are known today particularly for surviving architecture dating to the 5th century era, but extensive excavations in the 50s and 60s also revealed a rich subsurface archaeology, presenting rare evidence of these first Christian religious communities on the great tidal river inlets of the time in the Wear. The region has seen heavy industrialisation and development, which has to an extent compromised the tangible and intangible values of these sites. Our project was set up to explore local people's perceptions of Wearmouth and Jarrow and the 7th century remains and their surroundings, and people's sense of connection to these heritage assets and if and how they valued them. The work was undertaken by myself and Sam Turner from Newcastle University, but also Dr. Sophie Laidler, who was working on the project as a research student, and the work is now published. We use structured walks and recording projects using phones and cameras to ask people to take photographs of things they felt were important within and around the monuments and the landscape. Focus groups and questionnaires run by Sophie were used to gather an input on the stories that made people feel connected or disconnected to the sites. What's interesting here, you can see in the pictures, we've got the paintings produced by local school children as part of the project, showing us the elements of this heritage landscape that they valued. And we can also see a monument to the Jarrow March, the great march of workers to the south that represented the need of industrial workers to have their poverty and extreme condition recognised in the time of the Great Depression. What's interesting then is that our outcomes are very informative, not necessarily understanding the connections, but the disconnections between local populations and the Wearmouth and Jarrow early Christian heritage. The things that were most important to local people, of course, the descendants of the local migrant workers that served the industries in the region, were the lost industrial heritage, the bulldozed back-to-back housing removed in the slum clearances in the 50s and 60s just ahead of the archaeological excavations, the monuments to the Great Jarrow March. The 7th century sites only became powerful in local identity when they could be connected to the important strands that people recognised that were familiar to them: migration and movement, travel, pilgrimage, industry and glassworking. The real lesson in this project was in looking for the synergies that had local value. A regular pilgrimage walk, for example, which many local people participate in, was by far the most mentioned pathway by which people understood and connected with these early Christian sites. We shared our findings with local stakeholders and museums in the region, helping to inform educational and recreational activities in the area. But as you can see from the Wordle there, one of the big takeaways here was just the need to make sure that local populations had a voice in how they felt about heritage and to give their sense of how they could connect to stories connected with that upstanding remains in archaeology within their local environment. Reflexive practice also formed a starting point for a relatively new project in Durham Archaeology funded by the Heritage Lottery Fund. David Petts, building on consistent work in the North East region with local archaeology and volunteer groups, initiated a more ambitious project aimed at drawing in a larger diversity of community partners, and this is Belief in the North. He opens up, pre to COVID, a consultation period and had an online sign-up of nearly 1,200 people in the initial phase. He did this using online and in-person events. The key thing about Belief in the North is that David invited all of those people to shape the agenda for research. And belief in the north developed because people were especially interested in looking at sites of religious significance, Christian and non-Christian. And the aim was to use our in-house lab facilities, commercial work and academic expertise to support a series of community-driven projects. 6 modules were developed, which involved training and related to specific sites in the region. And Billingham is one we've just completed with a number of excavations at a medieval palace site. But of course, lockdown happened during this process and David had to innovate. He actually drew on the experience of the Amina project, where our colleagues had been developing sort of a working relationship with officials and stakeholders in the Middle East and North Africa, and had been using online training to draw people into mapping projects using old digitized maps, satellite imagery, and sometimes LiDAR. By working together with officials and trainees online and annotating old maps and looking for sites and locating on the ground using satellite imagery, the Amina project had begun to develop a really nice co-productive model of working together with trainees and officials in identifying new archaeological sites. And David took this idea and developed an online Holy Wells project with volunteers during the lockdown period. Holy Wells are under research, feature the medieval and post-medieval landscape in Northern England. There's lots of them that appear on old and even new maps or are mentioned in place names. And David recruited around 30 volunteers to take part in an initial survey of historic mapping to pull together a working catalogue of Holy Wells in the region. And he was lucky to have the complete set of first edition maps available to volunteers online. Volunteers mapped locations, they catalogued these sites, they recorded them using Google Forms, and then they looked at online aerial photographic data. And all of that is now forming a basis for the next stage of the project, which will involve field visits and further documentary research. This is a great example of how volunteers can, in a ground up way, sort of decide on the priorities for a project, but also how we can innovate using our new skills from the COVID and lockdown period to actually sort of maximize local involvement and really sort of give agency to the volunteers and participants in the project and doing co-produced research using online resources. Now, work in South Asia and the Middle East by Durham Archaeology has been very much about training and empowering local officials, as I've just mentioned, and working with particular organisations. Training in Action really sort of stands out a bit of a beacon here, where Anna Leone has been a particular inspiration within her project and involving heritage officials in research linked to subsurface and above ground structures, where she's used workshops as drivers to bring trainees in North Africa together who bring raw data that they've collected and were helped to analyse it and produce research using GIS and other sort of analytical techniques, and then were helped to kind of co-produce publications from that research. We have, I guess, sort of shared between our work in the Northeast over a number of years, and with projects like Training in Action, shared this idea of using skills training to empower local societies and community groups. And I'm just very briefly here show 2 projects, the Auckland project, the very recent Yevering Environs project, and we could add the Binchester Roman Fort project as well here in the region, where we have, built in structured training elements with local community groups to really sort of increase the reach of our engagement. At Yevering, our project is now funded by the British Academy, and it's actually using geophysics as a starting point. You can see the magnetometry here on the slide of one of the big fields at this large early medieval palace site in Northumberland. But we're actually bringing in community volunteers to work with and analyse that data with us. And then in a second phase, they identify key features, subsurface features, and we enable them to go out using resistivity to check out those features more clearly. And in the next stage, we hope they'll be involved in deciding on which sites we might excavate and explore. So that funded project is really driving, a very interesting kind of collaboration between local volunteers in Northumberland, particularly with farmers and landowners, where we're exploring and showing them the importance of subsurface features and helping them think about what may not just be above ground in terms of heritage in that landscape, but what's below ground as well, and how they might think about researching and caring for that kind of heritage. This is a great way, I think, to have brought local volunteer groups together with experts, with the potential for some really productive results, and is definitely inspired by some of our overseas projects like Training in Action, where we've seen great results coming from that kind of co-productive partnership. And I want to finish really in thinking about co-production with a really outstanding showcase project from the department run by Rebecca Gowlands, working with the Washburn Heritage Centre and also with York University and York Archaeological Trust. In brief, the Washburn Heritage Community Group had a new heritage centre developed, and during the building of that project, a number of skeletons were excavated and revealed on the site. And these turned out to be at least 21 individuals or more who had been buried in the 19th century, or the remains dated to the 19th century. And because of really fantastic documentation that survived, 21 of those individuals could be identified within documents and actually named as individuals. This really led to an amazing project called the Fuston Assemblage Project, where Becky and her team drew on the citizen science model, involving local volunteers from the Washburn Heritage Centre in research on those remains in terms of both documentation and developing osteoprofiles and biographies for those individuals, but also on situating their lives in context within the Washburn Valley. It offered a unique chance to engage volunteers in a participatory project centred on archaeological science and bioarchaeological approaches. And it was a very powerful project with very challenging results. Many of those individuals were actually children. You can see there from the age group demographics who had died particularly young. And these were pauper apprentices who were brought from the workhouses for the poor and orphaned in the south of England and put to work in the great industrial 19th century cotton mills of the north. And as a consequence, the bones themselves, revealed the extreme stress and malnourishment and poor treatment that these poor individuals had undergone within this industrial period of time. What's amazing is that this project produced really high quality engagement because there were actually living relatives of some of the named and identified people. And the Meet the Ancestors Day was a particularly great experience in this respect, in which families could view the remains of their ancestors and have an osteologist talk them through the osteobiographies of those individuals. It was a very emotional project and produced numerous outputs, not least a monograph and a popular book, but also a permanent exhibition and art displays, a short film, and songs and artistic outputs as well. So for me, this is an exemplary project for how we can really mobilise scientific knowledge and facilities, expertise in a truly sort of co-productive partnership where entirely new discoveries are made of real significance in terms of health, well-being and inequality in the industrial past, but also connecting living populations with some of those ideas about health and well-being and the human body within the present. So those are a few examples that I think show how working locally anywhere in the world can make a difference. And I've chosen here to focus on the Northeast region because I believe this kind of ground-up work is powerful and effective in connecting people to place and heritage and in creating multicultural, accessible narratives around places and monuments and collections that can encourage people to empathise, connect and care for the heritage within their environs. I think these few examples show how powerful heritage can be in a positive way, even when you have challenging stories, and demonstrate that there's a way of working together in a local sense that can broker connection and care, but has really big potential impacts as well. We can work together to create shared local narratives and create more compelling and inclusive stories, but only if we work with people and listen to them. If we enrich people's understanding and skills, we can also enable communities to research and care for their heritage themselves. And finally, I think these examples show us that we embed values and notions of care and protection within our work with communities, we enable them to better advocate for the assets that are within their care. And that in turn can lead to much bigger results from these partnerships at a local level. Heritage can be an economic driver, an educational platform. It can help in terms of developing multicultural dialogues and cooperation around heritage. And also it can be a building block to a bigger global dialogue. And I hope in future years we'll be using the local approach in different parts of the world to, with our new partners at ITT and the Archaeological Survey in India perhaps as well, to develop these bridges between local heritage and a global dialogue about how we protect and present heritage for the future worldwide. Thank you.
Sarah, thank you very much indeed. I hope you can hear me. I've had to transfer onto my iPad, but thank you so much for that brilliant talk that took a wide scope of all the things that we're doing at Durham and that relationship between the community and archaeology in the modern world is fantastic. So thank you very much. We can draw out at the end some of the recurring themes that are coming across the 4 presentations. But in the interests of time, I think we could go to the 4th presentation, which is Professor Robin Conyngham, our UNESCO chair, is going to talk about From Kathmandu's Earthquake to the Bombing of Jaffna Fort, the role of archaeology in South Asian post-disaster heritage responses. So we'll go over to Professor Conyngham. And I think, Robin, I think are you thinking that you will use the pre-recorded talk too?
Yes, yeah, yes. And that way I can stick to 15 minutes.
That's great. That's fantastic. Falguni, perhaps you have Robin's recorded presentation.
Yes, I'll.
Thank you.
I'd like to start my talk by thanking the organisers of this seminar for inviting me to speak on the role of archaeology in South Asian post-disaster heritage responses. I'll take you into the context, as I see it, of heritage at risk within Southern Asia, then introduce you to our work at the 2015 Gurkha earthquake, understanding how we converted lessons learned into action, and then how we successfully managed to translate and transfer the approach to Jaffna. First of all, the context. In 2017, a group of archaeologists, policymakers and heritage practitioners gathered in Kathmandu to discuss some of the key challenges to the protection and rehabilitation of cultural heritage within Southern Asia. We recognised that heritage within the region was at risk from natural agency, floods, tsunamis, earthquakes, for example, as well as longer term linked to rainfall, sea level rise, and also salination. We also acknowledged the role of humans through rapid urbanisation, conflict, iconoclasm, looting, and also the illicit trade. And also those longer term human impacts from tourism and pilgrimage, encroaching cultivation, and also neglect and poor conservation. Why did we feel it was so important to protect heritage? Because all of us acknowledge that heritage, tangible and intangible, needs to be protected and managed because they can be drivers for achieving the strategic development goals. And they can also be enablers for those. In particular, I'd like to talk about SDG 11 and SDG 17. These are core to the work of the UNESCO Chair, where we work with partners and we co-design activities currently largely across Southern Asia. The next section is to talk about the Gurkha earthquake and the challenges to heritage protection. Of course, with the magnitude of the earthquake, it was a human disaster, economies and lives destroyed. But also it saw the destruction of many of the key monuments making up Kathmandu's UNESCO World Heritage Property. Immediately after the disaster, JCBs and bulldozers were mobilized to try and clear this historic rubble to reach the injured and the dead, and also to clear the streets. Piled into trucks, it was then dumped beyond the city. In many cases, historic buildings were then cleaned out. All the archaeological materials, the levels, were just removed without recording. And we began to realize that this was a second cultural disaster, stripping out what were a series of different layers which recorded the historic attempts to make structures within Kathmandu earthquake resistant and resilient. So working with the government of Nepal and also UNESCO, we selected a key building to be an exemplar to see what sort of information one can gather. And we selected the Kathmandu shown here in this Victorian illustration. And it is the eponymous building of Kathmandu from which the city derives its name. At that time, thought no older than the 15th or 16th century. This was the site when we got there after the bulldozers. Using traditional archaeological approaches of gridding, excavation, recording everything, we steadily moved through the debris, through the later accretions and medieval adaptations until we got to its original formation, which you can see as a mandala form of 9 cells. In the upper levels, we found very clear evidence of the poor use of mechanized heavy machinery, such as these huge gouges from JCBs and bulldozers. About a third of the building was destroyed. We also recorded those personal objects belonging to the 70 or so individuals who died when the building collapsed at a blood donation camp. It also became very clear quickly that the damage that we could see to the building was through that emergency recovery phase, and that actually the structure itself, with its massive walls measuring 12 meters by 12 meters and 2 meters deep, the foundations were undamaged by the earthquake, or indeed Kathmandu's earthquakes every 100 years. And we found very clear evidence of how the timber superstructure linked into the foundation through these tenon and mortise joints. When we cleared off the rubble, however, we found that we could identify where 3 of the main 4 pillars had linked the foundations with the superstructure, but 1 was missing in the bottom right. Here you can see we found it underneath tiles dating to the 1970s. The conservation activities had found that that pillar, the tenon joint, had rotted, and instead of replacing it, they pushed the tiles underneath. We also noted copper oxide on the bottom of some of the saddle stones, as well as copper shoes, which would have gone round the tenon joints at the bottom of those saddle stones. And working with architects and engineers, reconstructed that building. Also working with geoarchaeologists, in particular Professor Ian Simpson, we began to reconstruct through radiocarbon dates and optically stimulated luminescence dating the life biography of the building from its collapse in 2015 back to its initial construction in about 700 CE, and also through radiocarbon dates identified some of the timber members, such as this lion-headed capital, dating to about 500 CE. We also interviewed local residents, most of whom felt completely separated from the process of reconstruction. The next step is how to turn these observations, lessons learned, into action. So as we identified a gap in terms of debris management, particularly UNDP don't differentiate between contemporary modern debris and historic debris, we requested the government of Nepal, and we worked with police and army on a reconstruction of a disaster on a building that had come down, collapsed after the earthquake. We created grids and cleared the material from one grid quickly by putting the material into a duplicate grid nearby. And here are army and police officers undertaking this clearing. It also allowed us to identify material for recycling, because every new brick of this historic fabric that needed to be reconstructed would cost about £1.85 to reconstruct, plus the environmental cost. And this is our first cohort of those that we trained. This is the old army barracks near the Kathmandu. Here you can see the washing line, working with Annie Joshi, an architect, and Kai Vaisi, another architect. We converted their barracks into a new earthquake museum, where we remembered the loss, but also shared custodianship with creative individuals like artists, as well as neighbours, to put in their earthquake story. And then it was opened by Her Excellency, the President of Nepal. In addition to the academic outputs, working with engineers, we also worked with the community. The building was handed back to the community. Here is the puja to cleanse it. And then the community used some of that archaeological evidence. If you look closely, you can see the copper shoe on the end of the new pillar, actually taking this indigenous knowledge, because the copper is meant to corrode as it becomes oxide. It retards both the growth of mold, but also termites. And then the community reconstructed it, not using mechanized machinery, but actually using bamboo and their own hands. So what about translating this learning? Well, some of the archaeologists had been supported to be there, not just Nepali, but from India, Myanmar, and Sri Lanka. And an invitation came from the Director General of the Central Cultural Fund of Sri Lanka, Professor Prashanta Gunawardena, to work in Jaffna at historic Jaffna Fort. Here is the fort taken when we started the work in 2017 and 2018. If you look closely, actually many of the buildings were destroyed during the 30 Years Civil War. Here is the governor's palace, destroyed, and this is the Great Krieskirk, built in the early 18th century by the Dutch colonial powers, and bombed and blasted into rubble. Again, how to put the learning into action. Again, we created grids as archaeologists and moved the material to duplicate grids. This allowed us to steadily work through the rubble. In the upper levels, of course, we found evidence of the war, the conflict, both the personal objects and the weapons of destruction. But also in the rubble, we began to find ornamentation and also gravestones. Some of those gravestones we were able to link to some of the published records, such as this of George Burley. But also we found hidden histories. This slab from the floor actually records the burial place of the wife of one of the Tamil padres who lived there in the fort, something that was never recorded before. We also managed to separate out Dutch bricks imported in the 18th century and also coral, neither of which of these materials are available today. So the recycling is critical. As we were going through the debris, we also found that the Dutch had incorporated elements of granite slabs, which we identified as coming from earlier Hindu temples near or at the site. Here you can see with this lotus. And this began to suggest a longevity for the site. Working with students here from the Central Cultural Fund and the University of Jaffna, we began to push back the date of Dutch colonial Jaffna fort from the 17th century and push it straight back into the period of the early historic world, and as early as 500 BCE. With evidence of Indian Ocean trade, a continuity, not a history just starting with the Dutch or the Portuguese before them. We held a festival for the residents living nearby, and we had a trilingual exhibition in one of the powder rooms in the castle exhibiting. This is one of the most exciting boards that we have trilingually, because it says, although the fort is known for its colonial architecture, the project that was undertaken by these partners identified that if Jaffna's history was condensed into a day, the colonial era would only start at 3 minutes before midnight. This is part of the work undertaken by the UNESCO chair. We would be unable to undertake it without the support of all of these organizations, universities, NGOs, and charities as well. And these funding bodies and these academic bodies and these practitioner bodies are key for continuing this work. This, we believe, is the role of archaeology. We shouldn't be bystanders, but actually we have a major role to contribute, and in so doing can contribute to those goals of SDG 11 and 17. Thank you very much.
Robin, thank you so much for that presentation. It was fantastic, and your finale there really leads into discussion that we can have now. Some maybe questions and comments and discussion across the two institutions and involving our students who are with us and participants. And I wonder if we could maybe start, we can start with some questions if there are questions from the floor, but perhaps we could also think about the recurring themes that are running through the four presentations. Again, as a non-archaeologist, I'm picking up on these issues of conservation of world heritage, the risks and impact of natural disasters, continuity and links between the history and the modern world, and community, and how archaeologists, these very strongly coming out as how archaeologists are working with these sites, through professional approaches and through programs, university programs. So I'm going to open it up to the floor now, questions or comments. Would anyone like to start?
I see that Professor Robin Cunningham has a question for me in the chat box, and
right,
is it okay if I take that up?
Yes, please do, Professor Sharada. That would be great. So, I can't see the question and answers from here.
Okay, so he asks me that has any GCMS analysis been conducted on ceramic vessels, and has it helped to compare the contemporary and ancient diets? So, well, to answer your question, first of all, I think you would be. We kind of have a common student between us, that is Ahana, who is my doctoral student, but she is, of course, she has this wonderful opportunity of being mentored by you for the Antiquity Durham Fellowship of opportunity. So yes, when we were doing literature review, we have very few instances of such analysis being done in the ceramics. If we only look at the region of Gujarat, there's just one study that has recently been published by Kalyan Chakraborty, who was a student of Deccan College, and then he went to Canada to the University of Toronto to work with Heather Miller, and he published his results on the GCMS, that is gas chromatography mass spectrometric analysis of ceramic vessels from the site of Kotara Bhadli, which is in the Kutch region, a very small settlement. And I think he published results of this analysis from 59 sherds. And he kind of, so this study came a bit later. So before that, he had conducted isotopic analysis of domestic animal teeth enamel, and he had tried to establish the paleo diets of the domestic animals at the site, whether they were being fed on fodder or whether they're being left free to kind of free range and feed themselves. And so in continuation of that study, he also conducted the ceramic analysis, the GCMS analysis of the ceramic sherds to understand whether these very animals were being in fact consumed or what aspects of these animals, the dairy products or the animals were being butchered and their meat was being cooked in the very ceramics that come from the site. So his study shows, firstly, that certain types of vessels were used for the cooking or storing, cooking, yes, and boiling of certain types of lipids. So lipids basically come from either the dairy products or the animal fat themselves. So he could clearly see some kind of a correlation between vessel use and the kind of food that was being cooked in it. So it's basically any kind of vessel being cooked for being used for any kind of cooking that was not the outcome of this research. And so for this analysis, he used GCMS and quite promising results to show the correlation between not just vessel typology or technology, but also the functional aspect of the vessels, and correlating it with the kind of animals that were present at the site and how they were being exploited. A similar study is also there from the northern part of India, from Haryana, by Akshita Suryanarayan, who was earlier a doctoral student of Professor Cameron Petrie at Cambridge University. And her studies also contribute to this, but from a different region. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor Sharada.
Just one last point.
Oh,
so there is no
ahead.
comparison between the contemporary and the ancient diets. So he has only spoken of the ancient diets, and he does not try to trace it, the similar patterns of vessel use or animal meat and dairy consumption to the present times.
Thank you so much, Professor Sharada. There's a couple more questions coming in. One from Ravgi Kanprasad for Robin Conningham. Ravi, do you want to unmute and ask your own question, or would you prefer me to ask it for you? Okay,
right.
I'll ask it.
I can see it in
you
front of me on the
great,
chat bar.
that's fantastic.
So in terms of
ahead.
the zoo archaeology, we have a complete zoo archaeological report for Jaffna Fort, conducted by Jude Pereira, formerly of the Department of Archaeology, Government of Sri Lanka. That is fascinating. We haven't yet got the radiocarbon dates for that site yet. In terms of the Kastamandap and the work in Kathmandu, the site, we dated the foundations through OSL dating, so optically stimulated luminescence dating. So we prefer using that, although it's far more expensive, mainly because the error ranges are so low. So we work very closely with Professor Ian Simpson, who's recently retired from Stirling, and I'm delighted is becoming an honorary research fellow at Durham. And so we've got really very, very strong dates. And even before the Kastamandap is begun in Kathmandu at about 700, we've got evidence for occupation within the city of Kathmandu, probably dating back to about 200 BCE. So really interesting in terms of development of urbanization there. We also were allowed fairly uniquely to do an awful lot of radiocarbon dating of timbers. So this is the first time we've managed to get access, and it surprised us with that amazing lion-headed capital, which we all thought was sort of later medieval, but suddenly the dates we have for it are 500 CE. So almost a Lichvi date, which is really very, very exciting. And the radiocarbon samples we've taken from the exterior as well as the interior, because of course you would anticipate different dates. We've taken those radiocarbon dates from the main timbers. Most of those are about 1,000. And then we've even found where repairs have been made at a different date through new tenons being put in. So again, the scientific analysis through the use of OSL dating and also C14 dating has given us this really intricate understanding of a building in such a seismic sort of vulnerable area, how actually the process of restoration, renovation, continual is the way to allow resilience to those almost, a shock every 100 years, which is why the building, was fully erected by 1100, only came down in 2015. And there are no modern buildings in Kathmandu which will have that longevity. So we can really learn about seismic resilience and also indigenous knowledge and one of our challenges is lots of modern materials come with ISOs, international standards. Timber, the sorts of timber we're dealing with doesn't come with that. Also, engineers come with recognizable qualifications. Master artisans don't, which is, really quite frustrating. So that's one of the areas we'd really like to see work on, trying to put the two technologies on a par in a way we've done very successfully with, say, Ayurvedic medicine and Western medicine. But technologies haven't yet been recognized in that way, because the artisans have such a wealth of knowledge.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Robin. Do we have any further questions? If anybody wants to ask another question or make a comment, then you can just unmute if you want to unmute and say something, or you can write something in the chat box. Has anyone got any further comments? Sorry,
I don't want to dominate, but I will just say that a message has been put in the chat bar from Ahana Ghosh, who Professor Sharada mentioned. And this, I think, is one of the really exciting steps forward. So as Professor Semple mentioned, Durham hosts an international journal of archaeology. I like to call it the International Journal of Archaeology, Antiquity. And we're close to celebrating 100 years, but with funding from the British Academy last year, we launched a new program to work with early career researchers from Africa, from the Middle East, and also from South Asia, to offer mentoring towards publication in that journal. And Ahana, Professor Sharada's student, is one of the 10 from South Asia. So that is a really exciting route for early career researchers to actually have them closely linked between our two institutions, but also to a career enhancing opportunity like that. And if we are able to increase those opportunities, really we will be benefiting the scholars of the future.
That's fantastic. And Hannah, I just saw your comment in the box there too. That's a fantastic way to link the two institutions through the journal, through publication, and really importantly, supporting early career researchers and doctoral students. That's brilliant. Thank you. So how are we doing for further comments? I can't see anything else in the chat. Thank you, Hannah. So if we do we have any further comments or points to make?
Catherine, sorry, I had my hand up, but I wanted to ask Professor Sharada perhaps if she could tell us more about the isotopic potential in terms of analysis. We've heard a lot about the Harappan civilization and traditions in terms of movement, and you were talking about navigation and seaboards and travel. What are they, what's the scope there for working with isotopic analysis, and what, perhaps what kind of things are coming through now from that sort of work?
Thank you, Sarah, for the question. So yeah, the potential is immense because this is like an unexplored territory for us, partly because very, very less research has been done in this area, and also because I think we kind of have caught on a bit late to this trend in archaeology that's kind of taken over the rest of the world, where people are just doing isotopic analysis on anything and everything, I mean, if they can. So, well, in isotopic analysis on human remains has also been very less. I remember a study by Professor Kenoyer, who himself first started this, and he wanted to look at the human burials from Mesopotamia and from the Harappan civilization, and to see if there has been any migration and movement between the peoples. And to corroborate or to kind of support his human isotopic data, he also conducted similar analysis on the local fauna as a baseline comparative series. So that was one of the first or initial projects that I can think of. And then there was a big kind of lag or gap in such studies, mainly because we were not aware of such facilities in India, or we were not sure how to, what samples to take, where to send them, how to get them analyzed, and how to interpret the results, because isotopic analysis is in itself quite a complex analysis, and many of us are still struggling to understand it conceptually and to interpret the data. But in the past few years, what is blossoming or burgeoning is the isotopic analysis on faunal material, mainly because they are available in extremely large numbers. Almost every archaeological site yields lakhs, if 100,000s of faunal remains, especially teeth of animal, both domestic and wild. And the teeth are an excellent source of finding out about the paleo diet of the animals, and indirectly also of the humans, through carbon and nitrogen isotope analysis of the water source, from the oxygen isotope analysis, and strontium isotope analysis to understand the provenance of these animals, whether they were raised locally or where they brought from somewhere else. And so the potential is immense, because I can count the number of sites that have undergone this analysis on probably just one hand, the fingers of one hand. And so it's something that we are slowly starting to do. And IIT Gandhinagar, for instance, has the facilities to do this kind of analysis. And for some of the analysis, we may need to go to some other institutes, but those possibilities have also increased, especially through collaborations like this. So yes, and I think they will add a lot of data to the larger questions of, say, paleo environment or paleoclimate, and add to the environmental data of the region or of the civilization or of the culture when corroborated with, say, plant remains or climate studies. So yeah, the potential is huge.
That's fantastic. I mean, I know that my colleagues would be really excited to hear more about that. And that potential sounds amazing. So it'd be great to explore that with you.
Well, we're coming to the end of our time, and I think that was a great moment to finish, Sarah and Professor Sharada, because the next step is to think about how we can move forward. And I really appreciated Amit's points about those mutual beneficial areas that to establish where the two departments and where the two groups of academic can really benefit from each other and really sort of present complementary work. So I guess we should get our heads together after this meeting at some point to talk about that, and to talk about what the next steps might be, and what's manageable within a shorter time frame and a longer time frame, and make some plans. So I guess we could set that meeting up following this. And I just wanted to also finally say that Darren Grock is on this call from Earth Sciences, and perhaps one of the next steps could be to set up perhaps it's next Earth Sciences turn to set up a seminar, perhaps with that existing link. Yeah, I mean, I think we'll talk soon about how we can move this collaboration forward. It's been a fantastic morning. I've really enjoyed it from start to finish, and it's the start of a very exciting collaboration between our two institutions. Huge thanks to everybody on both sides, at IIT Gandhinagar and at Durham. In all, huge amount of effort has gone into preparing this. Thank you very much indeed, Sarah and Robin and Professor Sharada and Professor Prabhakar, and all of the colleagues who've attended. It's been great. So we'll certainly be picking this up very soon, and moving forward. A huge thank you to Somnath. I think he's still on this call. Thank you so much, Somnath, for all your efforts in galvanizing us and getting us together, and to Falguni Taylor for being there for the technical side and preparing everything. Thanks very much, everybody, and I hope you enjoy. Hi, Falguni, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll be back in touch very soon for the very exciting next steps in this collaboration. Thanks very much indeed, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Have a nice day.
More soon. Have a nice day,
Bye.
everyone, and evening. Bye. Bye.
Bye.